The wind never stops out here. It's been carving this dry lake bed for thousands of years, stripping away layer after layer of sand, and in 1968, it uncovers something it shouldn't. A geologist walking the dunes of a vanished lake in outback Australia notices bone fragments sitting loose in the sand. Old, clearly, but something about them is wrong. They're stained a deep, unnatural red, too deliberate to be weathering. Most people picture ancient as pyramids or togas or stone columns in Rome. Give it 5,000 years, maybe 10, and you've reached the edge of what feels imaginable. What's surfacing here is going to blow straight past that number into territory most of us have never actually had to picture. Someone was here, on the shore of a lake that no longer exists, 40,000 years ago. And whatever they were doing looks less like an accident, and more like a choice. Once the rest of the skeleton comes free of the sand, the picture gets a lot harder to explain away. The body is on its back. The hands are folded, resting together over the pelvis. And that red pigment isn't a stray smudge. It runs from the skull down to the hips, like it was applied on purpose. This isn't a place where someone happened to die. It's a burial. We tend to assume that kind of care, positioning a body, marking it with color, treating death as something that deserves ceremony, belongs to later humans. People with cities. People with writing. People who'd figured out agriculture and had time left over for symbolism. But here, someone took the time to arrange this body with intention, long before any of that existed. Which means the pigment itself has a story. It didn't just appear in someone's hand. Someone had to go get it. The geologist behind the find was Jim Bowler, and getting an actual number on this burial took decades, not an afternoon. The first estimates, in the late 1960s, put the remains somewhere between 20 and 30,000 years old. Later testing, using different dating methods on the surrounding sediment, pushed that figure up toward 40,000. That's not the end of it, though. Some researchers, working from the layers the male skeleton was found in, have argued the number could run even older, well past 40,000, into a range that's still genuinely debated among specialists. So there isn't one clean, agreed-upon age sitting in a textbook somewhere. There's a contested figure, refined over and over as new techniques arrive. What isn't in dispute is the ballpark, tens of thousands of years. Which makes the pigment even stranger, because nothing that red occurs naturally anywhere near where this body was found. Here's where the story stops being simple. The nearest known source of that red ochre sits roughly 97 kilometers from where the body was found. 97 kilometers. On foot, across dry, unforgiving terrain, with no way to know exactly how the material moved, whether one person carried it that whole distance, or whether it passed hand to hand through a wider network of people who all understood what it was for. Either way, the easy explanation collapses. This wasn't someone grabbing a handful of red dirt from nearby and improvising. Getting that pigment to this burial took planning. It took someone valuing it enough to go get it, or to trade for it, long before the funeral ever happened. That's not what we usually picture when we imagine people this far back in time. It suggests something closer to a shared understanding, a group of people who all agreed, in some unspoken way, on what this color was supposed to mean. This wasn't the only burial at this lake. A few years earlier, not far away, researchers had found a second set of remains, a woman from around the same period. But her body hadn't been treated the same way at all. She'd been cremated. Then deliberately her bones were crushed, then burned again, and finally buried. Two individuals close in time and location, handled through two completely different processes, one wrapped in ochre and laid out with care, the other reduced by fire and broken down before burial. That's not one strange, isolated act. That's a community with more than one accepted way of dealing with death, each apparently following its own set of rules. Whatever these people believed about dying, it wasn't a single improvised idea somebody had once. It was a tradition, one with enough depth and enough shared meaning to actually vary from person to person, which raises an uncomfortable question. How does something this deliberate just disappear from history for 40,000 years? For roughly 40,000 years, that lake bed just sat there. Sand moved over it, the water dried up completely, and no written record anywhere on Earth mentioned what had happened at this spot. By any outside measure, this ritual was gone. Except it wasn't not really. The Pakanji, Muthi, and Jayampa peoples never left this land. Their connection to it runs in an unbroken line straight through those 40,000 years up to right now. So lost turns out to be the wrong word, or at least an incomplete one. What actually happened is narrower and a little more uncomfortable. This knowledge was lost to written history, lost to archaeology, lost to everyone standing outside the continuous line of belonging. It was never lost to the people who'd been there the entire time. That distinction matters because it changes what happens next, what these two bodies, and the people connected to them, would go through once the outside world finally noticed. Once the remains left that lakebed, they didn't come straight back. For decades, they sat in research collections, studied, measured, dated, and redated hundreds of kilometers from home. Eventually, though, they were returned. Descendant communities received them back and buried them again, this time with their own ceremony, on the land they'd never actually left. Think about what that means. 40,000 years ago, someone folded a set of hands, spread ochre across a body, and laid it to rest with obvious care. And in recent years, people did something remarkably similar, took that same body, treated it with the same seriousness, and gave it a resting place again. Two funerals, separated by a gap of time that's almost impossible to hold in your head, both driven by the same basic instinct, that a person's remains deserve to be handled deliberately, not discarded. That instinct didn't belong to one ancient culture. It's shown up everywhere humans have ever grieved. This burial is often pointed to as some of the earliest solid evidence we have of symbolic thinking about death, proof that, at least 40,000 years ago, a body had already stopped being just a body. It had become something worth marking, worth treating with meaning. You still do a version of this. Flowers on a grave. A headstone with a name carved into it. A photograph kept somewhere close, long after someone's gone. None of that is a cultural invention layered on top of being human. It looks a lot more like a baseline feature of it, something closer to instinct than custom. Which means the assumption most of us start with, that this kind of ritual is a fairly recent development, has it backward. It isn't recent at all. It's ancient enough that it might be one of the oldest things people have ever done together. Go back to that dune, the wind, the bones catching the light in a color they shouldn't have. It's tempting to call this a rediscovery, something forgotten, finally found. But that's not quite right. Nothing was actually rediscovered. The world outside simply caught up to a ritual a community had carried, unbroken, the entire time. What was really uncovered that day wasn't a lost practice. It was one of the opening scenes in a much longer story, the story of how humans have handled death, carefully, deliberately, for as long as there have been humans to do it. Red ochre against pale bone. It happened 40,000 years ago. It's still happening, in its own way, every single time someone kneels down and leaves something at a grave.